She didn't expect the first trimester to hit like a quiet storm, soft on the outside, but powerful enough to shake her life from the inside out. And as Emily sat at the edge of her bed that early morning, holding a mug of warm ginger tea she hadn't even sipped yet, she stared at the faint sunlight slipping through her half-closed blinds, the room still wrapped in the kind of silence where your thoughts feel louder than anything around you. And she knew this silence had become the starting point of her survival. Her heart beat with a mix of excitement and fear, again the same mix she'd been waking up with ever since she saw that faint pink line on a plastic stick she'd placed on her bathroom counter. The shock from that moment still lingered in her bones like electricity. But now, 3 weeks later, the reality had fully arrived, the fatigue that made her bones feel heavy, the nausea that came in unpredictable waves, the emotional swings that left her smiling one minute and overwhelmed the next, and the quiet reminders from her body that everything inside her was changing day by day. She didn't know survival would begin so softly, one slow breath at a time, yet here she was, pulling herself through it with a strength she never knew she had. She pressed her hand low on her stomach, even though nothing was showing yet, and whispered silently to the life growing there, not because she expected a response, but because it made her feel less alone. And then the thought came, one she had been resisting. How am I supposed to survive this? Her mind played through every symptom she had read about but never fully understood until now: the exhaustion that didn't care how much she slept, the queasiness that showed up with no warning like a sudden wave crashing at her feet, the dizziness that made her sit down more often than she wanted to admit, the wild hormonal swings that made her cry in the car over a commercial about puppies, and that strange metallic taste in her mouth she couldn't explain no matter how many forums she scrolled. This wasn't a neat little checklist of symptoms anymore. This was real life, her life, wrapped in new sensations every single day. And yet, as overwhelming as it sometimes felt, she also knew deep within her that this trimester wasn't just about discomfort. It was about discovering a new kind of resilience she hadn't recognized before. She took a slow breath and let the air fill her lungs, grounding herself as she reminded her body that this chaos was temporary, that the exhaustion wouldn't last forever, that the morning sickness, no matter how intense, was a sign her body was working exactly as it needed to. And even though she couldn't see it, something tiny and miraculous inside her was growing stronger every day. She closed her eyes and knew that surviving the first trimester wasn't about pretending she felt okay. It was about honoring every moment exactly as it came. She thought about the nights she'd fallen asleep on the couch at PM without meaning to, the mornings she'd felt too nauseous to brush her teeth right away, the afternoons she'd had to cancel plans because her body demanded rest. And even the moments when she doubted her ability to handle all of this. She realized each of these moments, no matter how small, were actually steps that were guiding her toward a new version of herself, a version she was slowly learning to admire. And as she sat there, the tea finally beginning to cool in her hands, Emily whispered the promise she knew she needed most: I'm going to get through this. She let those words settle inside her, warm and steady, because surviving the first trimester wasn't about being perfect or strong every second. It was about giving herself grace, listening to her body asking for help when she needed it, resting without guilt, and understanding that every single symptom was a reminder of the miracle unfolding beneath her heartbeat. She stood up slowly, grounding her feet on the floor, and she felt something shift inside her, not her body, but her spirit, a quiet determination rising in her chest like a flicker of light. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning her body in a new way, learning her limits, learning her strength, learning the gentle language of early pregnancy that nobody else could translate for her. With one final deep breath, she set down the untouched tea, brushed her fingers through her hair, and stepped into the hallway with a calmness she didn't expect, knowing that this journey, messy, emotional, exhausting, beautiful, had only just begun. And even though the first trimester challenged her, she was becoming someone new because of it, someone stronger, someone softer, someone braver, someone who would make it through this chapter, one breath, one day, one small victory at a time. The next morning arrived with the same quiet heaviness, the kind that settles into your bones before you're even fully awake, and Emily opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light filling her bedroom, wondering how a single night's sleep could feel both too long and not nearly enough. She lay still for a moment, listening to her own breathing, the slight pressure in her chest, the soft swirl of her thoughts, and she felt that familiar wave of nausea rising like a tide she couldn't control. She turned onto her side, closing her eyes tightly as she pressed her hand against her stomach, whispering a shaky "okay, okay, I'm okay," even though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The first trimester had a way of arriving uninvited, unpredictable, sometimes unforgiving, and yet she knew that every moment she survived was a silent celebration of the tiny heartbeat growing inside her, the heartbeat she wouldn't hear for weeks but already felt deeply connected to in a way she couldn't explain. As she tried to steady her breathing, a sudden rush of emotion overtook her, not sadness, not fear exactly, but something heavy and fragile, something that made her eyes sting with tears she hadn't expected. No one told her how emotional she could feel over absolutely nothing and everything all at once. How her heart could feel like a cracked open door, letting in all the world's tenderness and pressure in the same breath, and she realized survival wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. It was learning how to carry feelings that didn't make sense and still move forward anyway. When she finally sat up slowly and carefully so she didn't upset her already sensitive stomach, she felt dizzy just for a second, but it was enough to remind her that her body was working overtime, building something she couldn't see but could definitely feel. She sighed, pressing her fingertips to her temples as she whispered to herself the mantra she had repeated all week, one moment at a time. And somehow those words steadied her, grounded her, made her feel less alone in the whirlwind that had become her everyday reality. She stood gripping the edge of the bed frame for balance and walked toward the bathroom with slow steps, each one a reminder of how different her body felt now, more delicate, more reactive, almost as if it were speaking a new language she hadn't learned how to translate yet. When she reached the mirror, she studied her reflection, noticing the faint tiredness beneath her eyes, the slight paleness in her cheeks, the way her expression seemed softer, more vulnerable, more open, and she thought to herself, I don't even look pregnant, but I feel it in every part of me. She splashed cool water on her face, letting it drip down her cheeks as she whispered softly, You're doing your best, because she needed to hear those words from someone, even if that someone was her own reflection. And as she dried her face gently, she felt a small wave of energy, just enough to keep moving. She walked to the kitchen, the morning sun spilling across the floor in golden streaks, and she grabbed a few crackers from the counter, remembering the advice she'd read somewhere about eating something simple before the nausea could take over completely. She leaned against the counter, munching slowly, her stomach settling just enough for her to breathe without tension. And she felt a tiny spark of victory ignite inside her, because surviving the first trimester sometimes meant celebrating the smallest wins, the ones no one else would understand. But as she stood there letting her body adjust, a sudden and overwhelming fatigue washed over her, the kind that made her shoulders slump and her knees soften. And she closed her eyes, exhaling deeply as she rested her forehead against the cool surface of the cabinet. She felt like crying again, not out of sadness, but because everything felt so heavy and so much at the same time. And then, without warning, she started crying, silent tears sliding down her cheeks as the rawness of the moment pressed into her chest, and instead of fighting it, she let herself feel it. She let the overwhelm spill out of her slowly, gently, because she knew she wasn't weak. She was exhausted, hormonal, overwhelmed, transforming, and that was okay. She whispered softly, I'm trying, and those words wrapped around her like a soft blanket, reminding her she didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to pretend she was fine every second of the day. After a moment, she wiped her tears, inhaled deeply, and felt her strength returning, not all at once, but gradually, like a soft sunrise creeping across the horizon. She walked back to the living room and sat on the couch, pulling her knees close to her chest and wrapping her arms around them as she allowed her heart to settle. She reached for her phone, opening a pregnancy app she had downloaded on the night she got her positive test result. And when she saw the little illustration of the tiny embryo inside her, no bigger than a blueberry, something inside her cracked open in the gentlest way, she smiled through the lingering tears, whispering softly, You're worth it, because even though the symptoms felt heavy and relentless, the thought of that tiny life growing inside her made the struggle feel purposeful, meaningful, sacred. She closed her eyes, letting the idea sink deeper into her soul. Surviving the first trimester wasn't about being strong every second. It was about trusting herself, embracing the messy days, celebrating the good ones, and remembering that every wave of discomfort meant her body was working incredibly hard to build something miraculous. And as she leaned back against the couch, her breathing calm and steady now, she whispered to the little life inside her, "We're going to get through this together," allowing her heart to soften and settle into a rhythm she hadn't felt in days, a rhythm filled with hope, resilience, and a quiet, unwavering love that would only grow stronger from here. The afternoon drifted in with a soft glow, the kind that filters gently through half-open curtains and paints the room in warm, quiet colors. And as Emily shifted on the couch, pulling a blanket over her legs, she felt the exhaustion return like a slow, heavy wave rolling over her body. It amazed her how fatigue during the first trimester didn't just make her tired, it reached into her bones, wrapped around her muscles, and tugged at her eyelids until the smallest tasks felt like uphill climbs. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of cars passing on the street. The little sounds that used to mean nothing but now felt oddly comforting, grounding her when everything inside her felt unpredictable. She closed her eyes and inhaled the soft scent of laundry detergent on the blanket, letting the familiar smell soothe her as she reminded herself that this exhaustion wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign that her body was performing a miracle she couldn't yet see. She imagined her tiny baby, no bigger than a seed or a pebble, depending on the week, quietly developing inside her, forming cells and organs, and a heartbeat that would one day echo through her whole world. And the thought filled her with a warmth that softened the edges of her exhaustion. But just as that warmth settled inside her, a sudden wave of nausea rose without warning, sharp, fast, unforgiving, and she sat up quickly, pressing her hand to her mouth as she leaned forward, breathing slowly through her nose. The unpredictable nature of the nausea had been one of the hardest parts of the first trimester. It didn't follow a schedule, didn't respect her routine, didn't care whether she was resting or working or in the middle of something important. It simply arrived whenever it wanted, demanding her full attention. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "It's okay, it'll pass," and she waited, focusing on each breath, reminding herself that this moment too was temporary. Slowly, the nausea eased, leaving behind a faint bitterness on her tongue and a heaviness in her chest, and she leaned back against the couch again, whispering a quiet "thank God" as she placed a hand over her stomach. It was in these moments, the ones no one saw, that she realized the first trimester was both fragile and fierce. She felt fragile in her body, fragile in her emotions, fragile in her strength, yet fiercely protective of the tiny life inside her, fiercely determined to push through the hardest moments, fiercely willing to do whatever it took. She thought back to a conversation she'd had with her best friend just a few days before, when she'd admitted how overwhelmed she felt, how out of control her body sometimes seemed, how confusing and intense the symptoms were. Her friend had listened quietly and then said something that stayed with her: "You're not meant to glide through this. You're meant to grow through it." Those words had wrapped themselves around her heart like a band of light, reminding her that survival wasn't about perfection, it was about learning, adapting, forgiving, and honoring the journey exactly as it unfolded. Wanting a moment of comfort, Emily reached for her phone again and opened her notes app where she had been quietly documenting each symptom, each feeling, each strange moment of the first trimester, not to scare herself but to remember to look back one day and say, "I lived through this." She scrolled through her entries, reading bits and pieces. Day 4, so tired I fell asleep during a commercial. Week 6, crying over running out of blueberries. Can't stand the smell of coffee anymore. Dreamed I was floating through clouds. Why am I hungry and nauseous at the same time? She laughed softly at some of them, her heart lifting as she realized how much she had already experienced in such a short time. She didn't know she'd become someone who documented the smallest details, but something about writing everything down made her feel safer, made her feel like there was order in the chaos, like she wasn't alone in navigating the unpredictable maze of early pregnancy. Her laughter softened when her stomach tightened with a small cramp, not painful, just a reminder, and she placed her hand gently over her lower belly again, whispering, "I'm doing this for you." She had found herself talking to her unborn baby more often than she expected, sometimes asking it to stay strong, sometimes telling it about her dreams for their future, sometimes simply whispering that she loved it even though she had never met it, even though she hadn't heard its heartbeat yet, even though it was still just a small cluster of developing cells. Yet her love felt real, deep, instinctive, something ancient and powerful that lived inside her without her permission and filled her with a purpose that made the hardest days feel manageable. A soft knock on her front door startled her from her thoughts, and she slowly pushed herself up from the couch, feeling the heaviness in her limbs, but also sensing a little spark of curiosity. She opened the door to find a small package sitting on her welcome mat. No note, no message, just her name written in neat handwriting. Confused, she brought it inside and opened it carefully, her breath catching when she saw what lay inside: a cozy pair of fuzzy socks, a small jar of ginger candies, a lavender candle, and a handwritten card that simply said, "For the days that feel harder than others, you're stronger than you think." She pressed the card to her chest, her heart swelling as she recognized the handwriting her sister's. A wave of emotion washed through her again, tender and overwhelming, and she sat down slowly, whispering, "Thank you," even though no one was there to hear it. She lit the lavender candle, watching the flame dance softly as the scent filled the room, soothing her senses, calming the lingering tension in her chest. She curled her legs beneath her on the couch and pulled on the fuzzy socks, feeling the soft fabric hug her feet, and for the first time that day, she felt genuinely comforted, supported, held. The first trimester made her feel alone sometimes, lost inside her own body. As changes but moments like this reminded her she wasn't alone at all. She had people who loved her, a baby who needed her, and a strength that was blooming quietly in the background of every difficult moment. She leaned her head back, letting her eyes drift closed, and whispered to herself, "I can do this. I am doing this," letting the truth of those words settle into her bones. And in that gentle, lavender-scented quiet, she felt something shift, something calm, steady, and powerful, something that told her she was not just surviving the first trimester. She was slowly, beautifully becoming the mother she was always meant to be. The evening settled over the neighborhood with the kind of soft calm that made the world feel gentler than it had earlier, and as Emily wrapped herself in a blanket and sat near the window, she watched the slow fade of daylight melt into dusky shades of purple and gold, feeling the quiet magic of the moment seep into her chest like warmth she didn't realize she desperately needed. The first trimester had turned her days into a strange mixture of chaos and calm, moments of sudden nausea followed by moments of absolute stillness, emotional waves rising out of nowhere and disappearing just as quickly, bursts of energy lasting only long enough for her to start something before her body reminded her to sit, slow down, breathe. And yet, tonight felt different, slower, softer, more forgiving, almost as if her body had granted her a small pocket of peace in the middle of everything, and she allowed herself to sink into it fully. She rested her forehead against the cool window pane, watching tiny raindrops begin to form patterns on the glass, and she felt her heart swell with a quiet sense of gratitude. Not because the symptoms had gone, but because she was learning to navigate them with a strength she hadn't known she carried. As she watched the rain thicken into a gentle drizzle, she remembered how everything had felt just weeks ago, how her world had tilted when she saw that positive pregnancy test, how she went from shock to joy to fear and back to joy again. How every feeling hit her harder than she expected, leaving her wondering whether she was really ready for this enormous shift in her life. But now, as she traced circles in the window fog with her fingertips, she realized that readiness didn't come fully formed in the beginning. It grew with her moment by moment, the same way her baby was growing deep inside her. She wasn't supposed to know how to handle it all at once. She was supposed to learn it slowly, through the messy mornings and tearful afternoons, through the cravings that made no sense and the exhaustion that seemed endless, through the tiny victories of keeping food down, getting out of bed, asking for help, and remembering to drink water even when she didn't feel like it. Each of these moments was shaping her into the mother she would become. Her eyes drifted toward the small journal on the coffee table, the one her sister had gifted her months before, with a note that said, "Write the parts of your life you never want to forget." At the time, Emily didn't know what those moments would be, but now she did. She reached for the journal, flipping through the blank pages until she reached the one that had her tiny handwriting across the top: First Trimester Survival. She smiled faintly at the title, half joke, half prayer, and she held her pen in her hand for a moment, thinking about what she wanted to write. And then, slowly, she began to pour her heart onto the page. She wrote about the fatigue that made her feel part human, part melting candle. She wrote about the nausea that visited at random times like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. She wrote about the way her emotions felt like they were on a roller coaster she didn't sign up for, the way her fears crept in late at night, whispering questions about whether she'd be a good mother, whether she could handle this, whether she'd ever feel like herself again. And then she wrote about the moments that reminded her she wasn't alone, her sister's care package, her partner's hand resting softly on her back on the nights she felt sick, her friend's encouraging voice on the phone saying she had survived the same feelings and Emily would too. The words flowed from her like a release, like a weight lifting from her chest with every sentence she wrote. And by the time she set the pen down, her heart felt lighter, still tender, still vulnerable, but steadier, stronger, grounded. She pressed her palm to the page for a moment, letting her hand rest against the written reflections of her journey, and whispered softly, "I'm proud of you," not just to herself but to every version of her that had gotten her through the hardest days. The woman who cried over nothing. The woman who forced herself to eat a cracker when her stomach rebelled. The woman who feared the worst when the symptoms changed. The woman who dreamed of what the future might look like. The woman who carried every worry with grace she didn't even recognize. All of them, each version of her, deserved that whisper of pride. As the rain eased outside, the sky darkening into deeper shades of night, she stood and walked toward the kitchen, deciding to make herself something warm and comforting. She heated a small pot of broth, the gentle simmering sound filling the quiet space around her, and for a moment she simply listened, allowing the ordinary rhythm of the kitchen, the clink of the spoon, the soft bubble of the broth to ground her again. She wrapped her hands around the warm bowl once it was ready and carried it back to the living room, sinking into the couch cushions as she took small sips, letting the warmth settle into her chest, easing the tightness she hadn't realized was still there. She closed her eyes, savoring the calm that wrapped around her like a hug. Her phone buzzed softly on the cushion beside her, and she picked it up to see a message from her mother, a simple text that read, "Just checking on you. How are you feeling today?" And unexpectedly, her eyes filled with tears again, not from sadness but from the profound comfort of knowing someone cared enough to ask. She typed back slowly, "I'm doing okay. Some days are hard, but I'm learning." And her mother replied instantly, "I'm proud of you. You're stronger than you know." Emily pressed a hand to her heart, letting those words sink deep into the spaces where doubt sometimes settled, and she whispered them aloud, "Stronger than you know," letting them become a reminder she would carry with her for the rest of the trimester. The night grew quieter, wrapping her in a blanket of stillness as she curled against the couch pillows, the warmth of the broth still lingering in her chest. She rested her hand over her stomach once more, feeling that same sense of connection that had been growing stronger each day, and whispered, "We made it through today," letting the softness of her voice soothe both herself and the tiny life growing inside her. And in that moment, wrapped in warmth, surrounded by love, held by the gentle quiet of the night, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Peace, tender and unwavering, weaving its way through her heart as she drifted toward sleep, knowing that even on the hardest days she wasn't just surviving, she was becoming. The next morning arrived with a thin ribbon of sunlight stretching across the bedroom floor, glowing softly like a quiet promise of gentler hours ahead. And as Emily blinked awake, she felt that familiar mix of heaviness and hope settle into her body. For a moment, she didn't move, she simply lay still, listening to the slow rhythm of her breath, feeling the faint flutter of early nausea stir in her stomach like a warning bell she had grown all too used to. But instead of letting discouragement settle over her, she closed her eyes again and whispered softly, one step at a time, reminding herself that she didn't need to conquer the entire day at once, she just needed to begin. Slowly, she pushed the blanket aside and sat up, allowing her body the time it needed to adjust, her movements deliberate, her breaths deeper than usual, grounding herself before the morning fully unfolded around her. She shuffled toward the bathroom, turning on the tap and letting cool water spill into her palms before splashing it gently across her face. The sensation was refreshing, almost renewing, and she stared at her reflection in the mirror, the tired eyes, the slightly pale cheeks, the woman who had cried, laughed, worried, hoped, and survived dozens of emotional spirals in just a few weeks. But today she saw something else too, something she had missed before, resilience woven into her expression like a thread running through her soul. She reached up to brush a strand of hair behind her ear and whispered, "You're doing better than you think," letting those words soak in, letting them rebuild her from the inside out. After washing her face and brushing her teeth in slow, steady movements, she made her way to the kitchen, her feet patting softly against the floor. She opened a fresh packet of crackers, the only thing her stomach seemed willing to negotiate with these days, and took a careful bite, hoping it would ease the nausea before it fully took over. She prepared a cup of warm ginger tea, inhaling the calming scent as steam curled upward in delicate spirals. She held the cup between both hands, allowing the warmth to seep into her fingers. And for a moment she simply stood there, breathing deeply, grounding herself in simple comforts. Even though the world expected her to be strong, she had learned that strength didn't always look like bold steps. Sometimes it looked like small rituals done with tenderness, like feeding herself gently on the mornings her body felt too fragile to keep up. She settled on the couch, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, and reached for a small notebook she had started using as her survival planner, a guide not for perfection but for getting through the days with as much grace as possible. She flipped it open and glanced at her simple checklist for the day: hydrate, rest, eat something light, take vitamins, breathe deeply, go outside if possible, and ask for help when needed. None of these tasks were dramatic or grand, but together they formed the foundation of her first trimester survival. She checked off tea with a tiny smile, pleased with herself for doing even one thing right. She had come to understand that the early weeks of pregnancy weren't about productivity, they were about preservation, patience, and learning to trust her changing body even when it felt unpredictable. As the morning drifted into early afternoon, she stepped outside into the small garden behind her home, the crisp air brushing against her cheeks, refreshing and gentle all at once. She walked slowly along the narrow stone path, noticing things she usually overlooked: the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirping of birds, the faint smell of damp earth from last night's rain. Standing there, surrounded by quiet life and simple beauty, she felt her chest loosen, the worries she carried dissolving a little in the fresh air. She placed her hand over her belly, not feeling movement yet but knowing life was there, growing silently, depending on her strength and softness in equal measure. "We're getting through this," she whispered, and in that moment, she believed it fully. By late afternoon, a wave of fatigue washed over her, the kind that felt heavy enough to sink into her bones, so she curled up on the couch again, closing her eyes as her body eased into a much-needed nap. When she woke, the light outside had shifted, golden and warm, painting the walls of the room like a soft sunset mural. She sat up slowly, stretching her arms above her head, feeling both groggy and strangely renewed. It struck her then how pregnancy required her to surrender control of her schedule, her energy, her expectations. And while losing that control had frightened her at first, she was beginning to realize that it was teaching her something deeply important: how to listen, not just to her body but to her heart. Her phone buzzed again with another message, this time from her best friend, who wrote, "Thinking of you. Don't forget you're allowed to rest without guilt." Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion at the reminder. She typed back, "Trying my best," and her friend responded with a voice note full of warmth, saying, "You're doing more than enough. You're creating life." That alone is powerful. Emily pressed the phone to her heart, letting the reassurance settle into the places where doubt sometimes whispered too loudly. As evening returned, she lit a small candle on the windowsill, its soft glow filling the room with a sense of calm she had been craving all day. She prepared a simple dinner, something mild and easy, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. After cleaning up the dishes, she returned to the window, watching the world outside darken into a peaceful shade of blue. She wrapped herself in her blanket once more, curled into her favorite spot on the couch, her hand resting instinctively over her stomach. The silence around her didn't feel empty, it felt comforting, like a space created just for her to breathe, feel, reflect, and grow. As she closed her eyes, she repeated the mantra that had carried her through the hardest moments of the trimester: "I am learning. I am growing. I am stronger every day." And with those words wrapping around her like a gentle embrace, she eased into the quiet warmth of the night, ready to face tomorrow with steady courage and a heart full of hope. Night settled softly around the house, wrapping everything in its quiet glow as Emily prepared herself for bed, moving slowly, deliberately, as if each step held its own meaning in the journey she had been traveling through these unpredictable, tender, and transformative first trimester weeks. She brushed her teeth, washed her face with warm water, and gently massaged moisturizer into her skin, appreciating the small rituals that reminded her she was still herself even as she was becoming someone entirely new. When she slipped into bed, the sheets cool against her legs and the dim lamp casting a soft, amber halo across the room, she paused for a long moment, placing her hand over her abdomen the way she had done countless times before, her fingers trembling faintly with emotion. She didn't feel movement yet, but she felt presence, something so powerful, so life-changing, that it stirred her heart more deeply than anything else ever had. As she lay on her side, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders, she let her thoughts flow freely, drifting through the memories of the past several weeks. The fear she felt when she realized she might be pregnant. The shaky breath she took while holding the positive test in her trembling hands. The nausea that had dominated her mornings. The exhaustion that made her body feel borrowed rather than owned. The small victories she had earned by honoring her limits and learning to rest without guilt. She thought of the moments she had cried out of fear, overwhelm, frustration, and joy, and the moments she had laughed unexpectedly, discovering that even in discomfort there were pockets of light she didn't want to miss. Through every emotional storm, she had discovered pieces of herself she didn't know existed, pieces that were gentler, fiercer, more patient, more compassionate, more capable. And as she breathed deeply in the quiet of the night, she realized she had survived so much already, not because she was fearless, but because she refused to stop trying. She shifted slightly, pressing her cheek deeper into the pillow, and allowed the weight of that realization to steady her heartbeat. She was not just moving through the first trimester, she was growing through it, becoming more resilient with each challenge, more tender with every breath, more attuned to her body's whispers and signals. She had learned to pause when she needed it, to eat in small bites when her stomach rebelled, to sip water even when she felt too tired to lift the glass, to celebrate small wins, like getting out of bed or going for a short walk, to forgive herself on the days she couldn't do much more than breathe and exist. She had learned to ask for help and to accept it, understanding now that strength wasn't displayed through independence, it was displayed through honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to admit when she needed support. A gentle breeze drifted through the slightly open window, carrying with it the faint scent of night air, cool, clean, and comforting. The curtain swayed lightly, casting soft shadows on the walls that seemed to dance as if celebrating her quiet triumphs. She looked toward the ceiling, a faint smile forming on her lips as she acknowledged something she hadn't been able to see clearly before. She was not failing. She was adapting. She was not weak. She was transforming. She was not overwhelmed. She was learning the rhythm of a new season in her life, one that demanded patience and offered profound purpose in return. She had survived every uncertain morning, every exhausting afternoon, every emotional evening, and now resting in the dark and warmth of her room, she felt a sense of peace settle over her like a gentle blanket. Her phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, but she reached for it and opened the notes app anyway, typing slowly, thoughtfully, letting her heart guide her fingers. She wrote a message to herself. You did it. You made it through the hardest weeks. You didn't give up. You listened to your body. You gave yourself grace. And tomorrow, you'll continue with the same courage that carried you today. Reading the words back to herself, she felt a swell of pride she rarely allowed herself to feel. She put the phone down, letting her hand rest for a moment on the soft wood of the nightstand, and then turned back onto her side, pressing her knees slightly upward, instinctively seeking the most comfortable position for her and the life growing within her. Her thoughts drifted toward the future, not with fear but with cautious optimism. She pictured the second trimester arriving with calmer mornings, deeper breaths, slightly steadier energy, and the possibility of hearing her baby's heartbeat again, that tiny rhythmic pulse that had already rearranged her universe. She imagined the moment she would feel her baby move for the first time, the flutter that would shift into kicks and rolls, the physical proof that the love growing inside her was becoming more real every day. That simple thought filled her with a warmth so profound it brought a soft tear to the corner of her eye, which she wiped away with the back of her hand, smiling at the tenderness of the moment. The room seemed to breathe with her as she inhaled slowly and exhaled even slower, letting her body melt deeper into the mattress. The sounds of the night, the distant hum of a car, a faint rustle of leaves outside, the soft creaking of the house settling created a lullaby of ordinary comfort that eased her nerves and quieted her wandering thoughts. She whispered softly into the darkness, "We made it," acknowledging both herself and the tiny heart she carried. Those words held gratitude for the struggle, respect for the journey, and hope for the path ahead. Her eyes grew heavy, her breathing steadier, and as sleep approached in gentle waves, she felt something she hadn't felt this clearly in weeks: peace, deep and uncluttered. She knew tomorrow wouldn't be perfect, and the days ahead would still bring their share of challenges, but she also knew she was stronger now, wiser now, more grounded than she had been when the journey first began.